Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It's been a presidential visit that's broken all the diplomatic rules. Donald Trump has emerged from his talks with Theresa May in Chequers, hailing her leadership skills and declaring that the relationship between Britain and America is the highest level of special. This was a matter of hours after he'd attacked Mrs May's approach to Brexit and warned that her plans for trade with the EU would kill the chances of a deal with the US, though he then appeared to soften that view today. At Chequers, he repeated his assertion that immigration had caused major problems for Europe and that Brexit was happening because of concerns about levels of migration. Our first report this evening on this rather eventful presidential visit is by our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
You don't need to count the helicopters to know how much this visitor matters. President Trump's entourage blasted through the countryside as subtly as he warned this week that his host might not get the trade deal she covets. For Theresa May, her job was not just to grin and bear it today, but more importantly, to try to change his mind. When first the tricky question was asked, he left it to her.
Yeah, have you had a chance to talk about the interview this morning?
We've got a lot to discuss. We can discuss our special relationship.
The question repeated. This time, he made a face rather than answer. But after talks back to the choreography around the stately home, exactly where she brokered her Brexit compromise this time last week. The Prime Minister appeared to have taken hold of President Trump and predicted he's now on her side.
We agreed today that as the UK leaves the European Union, we will pursue an ambitious US-UK free trade agreement. The Chequers agreement reached last week provides the platform for Donald and me to agree an ambitious deal that works for both countries right across our economies.
Was he quite so convinced?
Once the Brexit process is concluded and perhaps the UK has left the EU, I don't know what they're going to do, but whatever you do is okay with me. That's your decision. Whatever you're going to do is okay with us. Just make sure we can trade together. That's all that matters.
Mr. President, you seem rather to have changed your tune from what you said earlier this week when you said that on the current Brexit plan, that would probably kill the possibility of a trade deal with the UK. Our countries are meant to have a special relationship, yet you publicly criticised the Prime Minister's policy and her personally for not listening to you this week. Is that really the behaviour of a friend? I
didn't criticise the Prime Minister. I have a lot of respect for the Prime Minister. And unfortunately, there was a story that was done which was, generally fine, but it didn't put in what I said about the Prime Minister, and I said tremendous things.
To be accurate, it did.
She's going to make a decision as to what she's going to do. The only thing I ask of Theresa is that we make sure we can trade, that we don't have any restrictions. I read reports where that won't be possible, but I believe after speaking with the Prime Minister's people and representatives and trade experts, it will absolutely be possible.
And Prime Minister, isn't the problem for you that some of the things Mr. Trump has said about your Brexit plan are right? It will limit the possibilities of doing trade deals easily in the future.
There will be no limit to the possibility of us doing trade deals around the rest of the world once we leave the European Union on the basis of the agreement that was made here at Chequers and that I've put forward to the European Union. And as you've heard from the President, the United States is keen for us, we're keen to work with them, and we will do a trade deal with them and with others around the rest of the world.
He said he'd suggested she should be tougher on Brexit, but never pull the plug on the deal.
And that Brexit is a very tough situation. That's a tough deal. Well, you can't walk away, because if she walks away, that means she's stuck. You can't walk away. But you can do other things. Now,
what about that oft-quoted special, if today, surreal relationship?
I would say the highest level of special. Now, am I allowed to go higher than that? I'm not sure. But it's the highest level of special. I would much rather have her as my friend than my enemy. That I can tell you.
And we are friends, Mr. President.
Where he leads, the Prime Minister is certainly not always willing to follow. But had the President not calmed his tone on Brexit, this vital moment would have been humiliating.
For years, British Prime Ministers have strained to show that they matter to the United States. They want to be listened to, they want to be respected. But with characteristic smash and grab style, Donald Trump has made that tricky, very tricky for Theresa May, just at the moment when she needs friends and reliable allies.
Goodbye to Chequers, then for the president to move to call on one of the few people in the world whose status rivals his.
The Queen has now met a dozen American presidents. This spectacle a product of all that shared history. These images, perhaps the ones Donald Trump truly desired. But the politics between the United States and Britain are fraught, the lines less precise. And as both our countries change, so diplomatic decorum isn't guaranteed. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Chequers.
So where does this leave us? In a moment, we'll be talking to our North America editor, John Sopel, who's at Windsor. But first, let's talk to Laura Kunsberg, who's at Chequers. And Laura, it really doesn't matter how effusive he was today, does it? Because the tensions and the differences are still there.
Well, the awkwardness was on display, despite the fact that President Trump did roll back from what were very clear criticisms of Theresa May. Chequers is always a bit of a parallel universe to the normal rough and tumble of Westminster politics. Throw President Trump into that mix and you had really what seemed at times a really surreal alternative reality. But on that central question of whether or not the US is up for a trade deal after Brexit, the change in tone from Donald Trump was absolutely vital to Downing Street. Yes, he still expressed reservations. He's clearly still worried about the kind of Brexit deal the UK might get. But the change in his language was absolutely crucial for Number 10 to have secured today. Because remember, her Brexit compromise, which curiously by coincidence was brokered here with the cabinet just 7 days ago, is the most important political project for Theresa May. And to have the most powerful leader in the Western world saying that it's not workable, it's not realistic, was a very damaging criticism hanging over her. And the fact that President Trump has rolled back somewhat is something that Downing Street will be greatly relieved at. But I think at this moment, when Theresa May is facing so many difficulties on all sides, the fact even that that support seemed rather qualified is a problem they can't just walk away from.
Laura, thanks. Let's go to John Sopel, who's at Windsor Castle for us. This phrase, John, the highest level of special, what do you read into that, and does it actually mean something?
Well, look, the British Prime Ministers love it when an American president talks about just how special the relationship is. Is it special? It's super special. And Donald Trump used the phrase, the highest level of special. But you judge things not by words, but by actions. And I thought that we shouldn't underestimate the significance of the gap between what Donald Trump gave in the interview he said to the Sun newspaper and what he said in that news conference that we were just hearing from Laura about. Donald Trump doesn't tend to do reverse thrusts. He doesn't tend to do U-turns, but he scaled back his language, particularly on the trade issue. He heaped and lavished praise on Theresa May. And something that I never thought I would hear, he said he apologised to her for the remarks that he made in the Sun newspaper. That augurs well, but trade is still going to be the big ticket issue. On other things like defence and intelligence, yes, there is a special relationship there. But if you look at some of the big ticket items that in the past Theresa May, Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, the allies if you like, have tried to get Donald Trump to change his mind on, the Iran nuclear deal, climate change, NATO, they haven't had a whole lot of success. Donald Trump will always go his own way. It looked like this was all careering off the tracks after that interview he gave the Sun newspaper. At the kind of news conference today, well, they somehow seem to get it back on the tracks.
John, many thanks again. John Sopel at Windsor Castle and Laura Kunsberg for us at Chequers. Well, across the UK today, tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets to protest against President Trump's visit. Protests right across the UK right now. In London, especially, thousands of people spending the day marching through the streets of central London, heading for Trafalgar Square, where we can join our special correspondent, Lucy Manning, who's there.
Well,
Well, President Trump might have hoped to have thousands lining the street for his first visit as president here to the UK, but this isn't what he would have had in mind. Every corner of Trafalgar Square is filled up now. This is, as you can hear, a massive protest. It has been a massive protest through the day. It has been a good human protest, but it has been one with a real sense of outrage.
Say it loud, say it clear, Donald Trump's not welcome here.
His name echoed round the streets of London. It was on the posters they carried, the T-shirts they wore. They were loud and they were certainly many, but as tens of thousands came to protest against President Trump, he wasn't even in the city to see or hear the anger. The relationship normally a special one, the highest level of special, said the president, but they weren't lining the streets for the American president, but against him.
I think his policies are awful. I think the way he talks to people, the way he talks about women, the way he talks about disabled people, the policies on climate change, the list of things he does wrong is long.
You're not going to stop Trump, are you?
I think peaceful protest is a beautiful thing.
What do you make of so many British people coming out against your president?
It's really nice that they care that much, about the injustices happening in our country.
The day of protest started with London's newest tourist attraction. Flying outside Parliament, the Trump baby balloon. Not huge in size, but big in impact.
I think it's brilliant. I think it's an epitome of British humour, really, and I think Trump doesn't get that. But I think it stands for the way that we deal with things we don't like.
Then this peculiarly British day of protest took to the streets, the Women's March starting the demonstrations, armed with song, pots and pans, wit and anger.
He is the worst thing to happen to the world right now. I have a daughter, I am a mother, I am a woman. He is not, we do not deserve him on this world. He's done nothing but wrong.
But is it for British people to say that about...
She does not like him. It's for anyone to say it, because we are citizens of the world.
We're not telling him necessarily he shouldn't be here. We're protesting some of the policy decisions he's made.
But America is our closest ally, so...
Yeah, and this is not against America, this is against Trump.
Then the main anti-Trump protest of the day, filling the streets of central London.
Well, the American president might not be in London to see and hear these protests, but he's certainly aware of them, saying he wasn't spending more time in the capital because he'd been made to feel unwelcome. But as Donald Trump said, he believes the real British people love the American president.
But those in Trafalgar Square this evening aren't the ones who love him, far from it. But with a welcome from the Queen, the Prime Minister, President Trump might just not mind about the protests. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Well, the President and First Lady have left Windsor and they're spending the weekend in Scotland. So let's join our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, at Turnberry. And Sarah, just talk us through what the plans are there for the weekend.
Well, there's no official schedule for the President this weekend. This is being described as a private visit. He's due to land in Scotland in about 90 minutes' time, and he'll be staying here at Trump Turnberry. I think it's a pretty safe bet to assume that he's going to fit in at least one round of golf whilst he's here, because he does say that this is one of his favourite properties. Meanwhile, in Glasgow city centre right now, about 50 miles away, there is an anti-Trump protest going on. The big Scottish demonstration, though, is planned as a march through Edinburgh city centre tomorrow. The question is whether, despite all the security around here, protesters will also try and get much nearer to Turnberry in an attempt to actually be seen by the President. They've been promising what they call creative direct action, although Police Scotland have already refused permission for that giant Trump baby balloon to be flown over the golf course tomorrow. Now, Trump, whilst he's here, has no plans to meet the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. She's been outspoken in her criticism of him in the past, and it's been reported today that he deeply dislikes her and bitches about her on the phone to Theresa May. Her deputy leader of the SNP, Keith Brown, he's going to tell that rally in Glasgow tonight that Scotland rejects Trump's politics of division and hate. But the First Minister herself, she's not planning to go to any of these anti-Trump demonstrations. Instead, this weekend, she's going to lead the Glasgow Pride March. And I assume she thinks that will send a message of its own.
Sarah, thanks very much once again. Sarah Smith, our Scotland editor there in Turnberry.
First, the interview savaging Theresa May and her Brexit strategy, then an apology, which was faint with praise. Donald Trump described Mrs May today in quite different terms. I think she's a terrific woman. She's doing a terrific job, standing side by side with the PM at Chequers, though Mr Trump did not quite stick to the script. Boris Johnson, he declared, would be a great Prime Minister. And he repeated his claim that immigration was a very negative thing for Europe. It's changing the culture, he said. In our first report tonight, here's Matt Fry.
They call these armoured limos the beasts, and today their wheels got to crunch the gravel at Chequers, not in menace, but in apparent remorse. This trip to rural Buckinghamshire, as opposed to iconic number 10, was always going to be a little awkward. But the President was on an apology tour, greeted by an ashen-faced hostess, smiling, but never with her eyes. Whether it was the retinue of advisors who finally managed to get into his head, or the daunting family portraits in the Great Hall, the ghosts of the past bearing down on the man from Queens, New York, Donald Trump looked like he was facing the diplomatic equivalent of root canal surgery for what he had said to the Sun about her and Brexit.
I would have done it much differently. I actually told Theresa May how to do it, but she didn't agree with it. She didn't listen to me.
What did you say?
She didn't listen. No, I told her how to do it. That will be up to her to say. But I told her how to do it. She wanted to go a different route.
Some had wondered whether after such a slur, Theresa May would go full Love Actually, as in the inspirational movie.
A friend who bullies us is no longer a friend. And since bullies only respond to strength, from now onward, I will be prepared to be much stronger.
But in the warm summer air of the walled garden, instead of Love Actually, we actually got love, or some version of it. Whatever was said behind closed doors, in the outdoors, we saw a very different Donald Trump.
This incredible woman right here is doing a fantastic job, a great job. And I mean that. And I must say that I have gotten to know Theresa May much better over the last 2 days than I've known her over the last year and a half. I mean, we've spent more time in the last 2 days. Yesterday I had breakfast, lunch, and dinner with her. Then I said, what are we doing tomorrow, which is today? Oh, you're having breakfast and lunch with Theresa May.
So whatever next, Mrs. May stuck to her script like a shield.
It is all of our responsibility to ensure that transatlantic unity endures, for it has been fundamental to the protection and projection of our interests and values for generations.
So what does Trump's best British friend make of it all?
This was a mildly apologetic, much calmer, polite Trump, but the words didn't sound that convincing to me.
Well, here's the point. If he goes from insult to apology and then perhaps back again, how can she trust him?
Well, there is an unpredictability about Donald Trump, and I think we've seen that through foreign policy and in many other areas. I think the trust, quite frankly, I think the trust is not her trusting him, it's him trusting her. She has been telling the world a series of things that frankly are not true.
Back at the press conference, the newfound romance began to wilt just a little.
They asked about Boris Johnson. I said, yeah, how would he be as a prime minister? I said, he'll be a great prime minister. He's been very nice to me. He's been saying very good things about me as president. I think he thinks I'm doing a great job. I am doing a great job, that I can tell you, just in case you haven't noticed.
What many had noticed is that Donald Trump also has eyes, well, for Donald Trump, and remains slavishly loyal to the issue that got him into politics in the first place, immigration.
I think that's very much hurt Germany. I think it's very much hurt other parts of Europe. And I know it's politically not necessarily correct to say that, but I'll say it, and I'll say it loud. And I think they better watch themselves, because you are changing culture, you are changing a lot of things, you're changing security, look at what's happening. I mean, you take a look. I mean, look at what's happening to different countries that never had difficulty, never had problems.
It was Mrs May's turn to find some steel.
The UK has a proud history of welcoming people who are fleeing persecution to our country. We have a proud history of welcoming people who want to come to our country to contribute to our economy and contribute to our society. And over the years, overall immigration has been good for the UK. It's brought people with different backgrounds, different outlooks here to the UK, and we've seen them contributing to our society and to our economy.
And then, once again, there was the truth, or Trump's version of it.
Well, if you remember, I was opening Turnberry the day before Brexit, and we had an unbelievably large number of reporters there because everybody was there, I guess, because of Brexit. And they all showed up on the 9th hole overlooking the ocean, and I said, what's going on? And all they wanted to talk about was Brexit. And they asked for my opinion, and I think you will agree that I said I think Brexit will happen. And it did happen, and then we cut the ribbon.
But so did this, the day after, not before Brexit.
Your people have taken the country back, and there's something very, very nice about that.
As a friend of Trump, does it not bother you that he just keeps lying about stuff?
Well, I think the thing about Donald Trump is this, that you should never take him literally, but you should always take him seriously.
One other reason why Trump was in a good mood could have been this. Inside, he'd been allowed to warm Churchill's armchair. The feel of the leather and the political pollen outside then egged him on to renew the vows that every British Prime Minister wants to hear from the lips of an American president. But can we take him seriously, if not literally?
I would say the highest level of special. Now, am I allowed to go higher than that? I'm not sure. But it's the highest level of special. They're very special people. It's a very special country. And as I said, I have a relationship because my mother was born in Scotland. So very important.
From the inflated Trump to the inflatable one, just about keeping in the skies above London, oblivious to the pageantry that hadn't even reached its climax in this state visit in everything but name. The Trumps meet the Queen at Windsor, the most elaborate cup of tea ever served, with an awkward two-step. But this is what royalty is there for, to make memories, above all for others.
Well, our political editor Gary Gibbon was at Chequers today, and he joins me now, and I suppose we really do have to admit this is a president without precedent.
Absolutely. Knowing that Theresa May, in Chequers a week ago, had hammered out a deal that had taken 2 years to get there, knowing full well she'd lost cabinet ministers in the process, he gives an interview which you can only assume was intended to destabilise, accusing her of taking too long over Brexit, accusing her of betraying the electorate, accusing her of making a trade deal with America impossible because of the route that she is going down. He then stands next to her at Chequers, recanting a bit, saying, oh, well, I've learned a bit more than I knew when I said those things. And he's also saying that he's been misquoted. Well, that's a bit raw, really, because he said, oh, there's an audio tape of this, so I'll be able to prove I'm misquoted. The Sun newspaper did the interview, had an audio on their website for the entire day. What does Theresa May do in these circumstances? She grins and bears it, or grimaces a bit. And other people might have taken a different approach. That's her approach. We have to keep pinching ourselves about how extraordinary these times are. It's possible to get shock fatigue. There's a president who couldn't come to London because he was scared of protests like this. A president who can't be relied on to say things that are remotely loyal. It is absolutely extraordinary. And to add to the sort of shock fatigue factor, we've just had the leader of the opposition here in the square at a demonstration saying the American president shouldn't be on British soil. I can't remember a moment in modern British history where anything like that has happened.
Well, then there's the question of trade, and he said one of the most damaging things he could possibly said, which was, if you go ahead with the way you're going at the moment, that was agreed in this place last week, you won't be doing any trade with us.
Absolutely, and as ever, Donald Trump says something and then slightly tries to patch it up and say something different, and he did that in the garden of Chequers earlier. On the way out of Chequers, I bumped into some Tory MPs who were going in, pro-Brexit MPs. They intend to rebel next week. They were on their way in for tea. They barely cleaned up the lunch in Chequers. And they were totally unconvinced by the recanting of Donald Trump. They think he was being honest the first time, pushed into it the second. International visits like this are meant to build up the leader you're going to see. They're meant to build you both up to an extent. He hasn't built Theresa May up at all. He's knocked her to the ground and barely pulled her back to her feet.
Gary Gibbon. Well, now, as he prepares to meet Vladimir Putin on Monday, President Trump has doubled down his attack on America's NATO allies, and now the European Union too. And then his day got even more complicated by the indictment of 12 Russian intelligence agents accused of hacking the Democratic Party during the 2016 election. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, is here with me now. Where does this leave the world, Lindsay?
Well, before he started this trip, Donald Trump said that maybe after NATO and meeting Theresa May, President Putin was going to be the easiest bit. Well, maybe not, because the indictment of these 12 Russian officials actually challenges the legitimacy of his election, and that's why he's so angry. This is about the alleged Russian meddling in the American elections. Now, one of the things that other politicians in America, particularly Democratic senators, are very worried about is he's supposed to spend 10 minutes alone with President Putin. Well, we have this issue now. We have the issue of Syria, where it is reported that he might be trying to do a deal with the Russians, which would really bring a lot of ballast to President Assad. And then Crimea. He blames the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea on President Obama. So this is not going to be easy diplomatically, and the diplomats around him are extremely worried about what he's going to do.
Well, one of the big questions really have to ask is, you know, where does this all go? Because you can't believe him from one minute to the next. I mean, he says one thing and then he changes it and then he says it again.
Yeah, but what he's doing is that there is a method, I think, in this, method in his madness, you might say, which is that he says something extreme and then he rolls back. So the aim is to disrupt. The aim is to keep everybody guessing, but in a way it's predictable. We know that that's what he does. So he does the interview with the Sun, he undermines the Prime Minister, and then he pulls back and says she's a tough and wonderful woman. But it does make him extremely difficult for other world leaders to deal with. Maybe even Vladimir Putin will find him difficult to deal with.
Let's see. That'll be Monday. Thanks very much indeed, Lindsay. Well, now, as you can see, this is quite a gathering here. If you look down on Trafalgar Square at this moment, it's a most extraordinary picture. You've got, I mean, banners. Well, talk about banners. There are plenty of them. And you've also got a sort of quite a festive atmosphere here in a sort of way. I mean, they don't like him, but they haven't seen him actually for real. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. When I was a student, I was brought here in 1961 to see JFK. My God, we wanted to see him. But no chance of any normal people seeing Mr. Donald Trump. Not a chance. They're not going to take the risk of exposing Donald Trump to the great British public. So that's that. Now, I'm joined now by the Labour MP, Rushanara Ali, and by Michael Avenatti. He's the lawyer representing Stormy Daniels, adult film actress who claims she had a consensual affair with President Donald Trump. Well, now, Rushanara, I mean, this is our ally. We've all learned to love America throughout our lives. Have we got to change our minds?
Not at all. We love America. We love Americans. They are our allies. But we don't approve or like what Donald Trump stands for. He's presided over expressing hatred towards women, towards Muslims, towards minorities, and he's locking up innocent children in cages. Those are not the values we stand for, and it's right that people are here to stand against what he stands for, but we share values with American values, and we will always have a special relationship with Americans.
Well, now, Mr. Avenatti, you are an American, yes, as I've mentioned. You've come over here effectively to protest.
Well, that's correct. I've come over to send a message to our allies here in the UK and elsewhere in the world that they are not alone in their disdain for this president. This president is an embarrassment to the United States. He is interjecting instability into the world and instability into these alliances, and it's a very, very dangerous situation. There are millions of Americans, John, that feel just like I feel. They are ashamed of the conduct of this president, and we want to send a message that our allies are not alone in their concern.
So what's the strategy with this case you're bringing for Stormy Daniels? I mean, it's Just to embarrass him?
No, not at all. It's to get to the bottom of it and to get to the truth. There's been a cover-up here relating to this $130,000 payment. It doesn't have anything to do with the sex and who slept with who. It's all about truth and the American people finding out the truth and being entitled to the truth. But in the meantime, this president is playing a very dangerous game day in and day out. He's very unpredictable. And for 100 years, America has been seen as a shining light, a stable force in the world, and that's changing, and it's disturbing.
Well, now, I mean, one of the things one finds oneself asking is, what about the trigger words that he uses in his speeches? It's all very well saying we're outraged and all the rest of it, but the fact is, the populism that he peddles, simply saying the word immigration raises a cheer amongst those people in the population who can be led by this sort of material.
Well, look, we have to stand up for the values that we believe in. And I think it's disgraceful that our Prime Minister has rolled out the red carpet and found a way through the back door to have the monarch having to meet this man who stands for hatred, stands for things that we don't believe in our democracy. And frankly, the American president is not just the American president. He has an important role of leadership around the world. And that's why it's right that we should stand against it. And of course,
but he was elected.
In the rise,
he was elected.
Yes, but in a democracy, people have the right to protest against elected representatives. And because he's a narcissist, he doesn't like that. He's hypersensitive and starts to go on the offensive. And frankly, our Prime Minister has seen this all blow up in her face, because what has he done? He's humiliated her. He stood next to her and said Boris Johnson would make a better Prime Minister.
But Michael Avenatti, the fact is a lot of Americans love him. They love to hear his talk. They like his crude language. They're fed up with the elite. They're fed up with lawyers. They're fed up with politicians. And they've suffered over the last few years, and they're thrilled with Donald Trump.
Well, Donald Trump is a very effective con man, and he conned a lot of Americans into believing something that just wasn't true. And that was, he conned a lot of white Americans, frankly, into believing that their continued success depended on the trampling of rights of women, Muslims, immigrants, and people from our southern border, outside of our southern border. And that's just not true. And I believe that in time, and we've already seen a progression, more and more Americans are going to come to the conclusion that they've been conned, and they will come to know that this is not the person that should represent the United States of America.
Rushanara, let's just cut to the quick. Should he have been invited?
He shouldn't have been invited. Certainly not for a state visit, certainly not for this
but he's our ally. We've got lots of his troops here.
I think it should have been an official visit. Theresa May met him in Brussels. She could have done business with him there. It didn't have to be organised in this way, where basically she hasn't honoured the wishes of the British people not to, lay out the red carpet, engage the monarchy in this, and humiliate herself, but also the whole country.
Very briefly, how will this go down in America?
How will this go down? I think it's going to get a lot of attention, and I think people in America are going to realize how dangerous this situation is. And here's the bottom line. If you want to be president of the United States, you need to act presidential.
Michael Avenatti, Rushanara, thank you very much indeed for coming. Well, this afternoon, Lindsay Hilson was down among the crowds of protesters who've been converging here on Trafalgar Square. Organisers claim there's up to 250,000 people on the streets in what they call a carnival of resistance. Here's Lindsay's report.
Full of hot air and hard to ignore. And I'm not talking about Churchill. The baby blimp was designed to mock a man never known to have laughed at a joke made at his expense. And not everyone in Parliament Square this morning appreciated the humour.
Well, I'm from New Zealand, and I probably think at the end of the day it is a little insulting to the American president, and they should probably take it down.
It's just a bit of humour and comedy. It's just a British way of making fun of politicians, so I think it's okay.
The first march of the day was led by women.
Racist, sexist, anti-gay, Donald Trump, go away!
The fury they felt when Donald Trump was elected despite boasting about grabbing women's genitals has not diminished.
I am a mixed-race lesbian. Nothing that he stands for is for me and my people. So I want him to go.
He has insulted our government, and he's locked up babies in cages in America. And I just had to come out and join the kind of collective expression of that disgust.
passionate crowd, and it hasn't escaped them that the two leaders who President Trump has insulted on his trip to Europe are Angela Merkel and Theresa May, two older, powerful women. And the other leader who he singled out was the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who happens to be a Muslim.
Few here would be natural supporters of Theresa May, but that doesn't mean they were happy about President Trump undermining her.
What do you think about the way President Trump has spoken about the Prime Minister?
Absolutely disgraceful.
I think he needs to learn to keep his mouth shut. I don't think we need to value a man's opinion who's a misogynist, a racist, and a liar.
A drag queen who'd come from Manchester found herself thinking about the 1930s and the rise of fascism.
I think it's an important thing to remember the lessons of history and where this kind of behaviour leads and the parallels, you know, that kind of use of right-wing support in order to gain political power and where that leads.
Amongst the young radicals, old liberals and generally outraged, a couple of marchers seemed a little out of place.
We love Trump!
Ah, you love Trump?
I do.
So why are you on this march?
I just came to march for Trump.
Do you feel a little outnumbered?
Sorry?
Do you feel a little outnumbered?
A little bit.
A little uncomfortable?
No, I'm okay here.
By mid-afternoon, the second march had started, bigger and broader, organised by various left-wing groups, but nonetheless attracting some who are not habitual protesters, yet feel strongly about President Trump. Once they'd arrived in Trafalgar Square, the crowd was addressed by the Labour leader.
Here in London and around this country, our message to our visitor is we are united in our hope for a world of justice, not division. We're united in our hope to end racism, misogyny.
President Trump avoided London because he didn't want to witness scenes like this. But it's hard to imagine that he won't hear about the protest or see it on television, and realise that many in the nation's capital did not welcome his visit.
Lindsay Hilson, and a tiny little news flash. It's raining in London, and that, for anybody living south of the Wash, is news after a month of none of it. More from us here in Trafalgar Square in a moment. Now over to Matt in the studio.
Thanks, John. Now, we've repeatedly asked for a government minister to appear on tonight's programme, but none were available. We did want to hear from the Conservatives, though, so we are now joined from Crickhowell in Wales by the leading Brexiteer and chair of the European Research Group, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Welcome to the programme, Jacob Rees-Mogg. What do you make of those demonstrations, tens of thousands of people in London?
Well, it's a free country. People are entitled to demonstrate.
OK, good. Now, you're famous for being an impeccably polite and cultured man. Do you think that Donald Trump's interview with The Sun was impeccably polite and the right thing to do as a guest in this country?
Well, he wasn't a guest in the country at the point. He was coming here.
Well,
and
he was on his way
asked a very
here.
straightforward question about... He was on his way here. He was asked a question about trade, and what he said is completely consistent with what the government's put in its white paper. You just need to look at page 49, paragraph 163, which says, in the context of trade negotiations, a common rule book for goods would limit the UK's ability to make changes to regulation in those areas covered by the rule book. And as non-tariff barriers are nowadays more important than tariff barriers, this will make trade deals with countries like the United States, but others beyond, extremely difficult. Right. So Donald Trump was speaking the truth, and that's very important.
So when it comes to Brexit, the existential issue of our time, you agree with Donald Trump?
On trade, the government agrees with Donald Trump. It's in its white paper.
And do you think it was right for him to praise Boris Johnson as a wonderful Prime Minister? That's a bit rude, isn't it, to Theresa May?
Why is that? Why is that rude? He was asked what he thought about Boris Johnson. He said he thought Boris Johnson was absolutely marvellous. He wasn't asked what he thought about Jeremy Corbyn. He may have said he thought Jeremy Corbyn was a splendid fellow too. I think you're completely entitled to praise people. And look what he said about Mrs May at Chequers, how wonderful he thinks she is, how admirable and how successful. So he's praising everybody. He's a very generous man with his praise.
And when he was praising Theresa May at Chequers, do you actually believe him? I mean, he seems to be changing his mind quite a lot about people. He did the same thing with Angela Merkel. He was very rude about her on Twitter and in interviews, and then he was very nice to her in person. That seems to be a bit of form there, doesn't it?
Well, I think he is a man who wants to put the interests of his country first and is tough in the way he negotiates and discusses things with other nations. But personally, he's very polite about people. And the Chequers news conference was an example of his good manners.
But this is a country that's divided about Brexit, and you in a party that's deeply divided about what kind of Brexit it wants. So are you happy to be behind the Donald Trump version of Brexit rather than the Prime Minister's version of Brexit?
Well, as I said, the Donald Trump version of Brexit is what the government has put out in its white paper. Now, Downing Street may be spinning something else, but that something else simply isn't right. That if you leave non-tariff barriers in place, it will be difficult to do trade deals. That's a fact. That's in the white paper. The government has accepted it. And if we're in the common rule book, which is in fact the EU's rule book, we will have the EU making our rules and effectively determining our ability to do trade deals. And that isn't Brexit. And whatever spin comes out of Downing Street, it still won't make it Brexit.
There were quite a few members of your own party today who said to Donald Trump, can you please leave us alone, don't meddle in our politics, butt out. Obviously you don't agree with them.
Well, I think it's silly to be discourteous to Donald Trump, who is our closest ally and a very important global figure with a democratic mandate from the United States of America. And there are some people, and you had that lawyer on a moment ago being interviewed by Jon Snow, who are very sniffy about Americans voting. I trust American democracy, so I think we must be respectful to the American president. And he's not interfering in our affairs. When Obama came here, he was coming during an election period and interfered directly. What Donald Trump has said is how America will react in terms of negotiating a trade deal if the UK is tied into the EU's rule book. That's a matter of American foreign policy.
First of all, Trump has come at an incredibly delicate time. The Foreign Secretary resigned on Monday. You could say this is a government in crisis. We may not have an election, but we are in a very perilous state. And at the same time, when Obama was here, you accused him of meddling.
Obama was coming during an election campaign and was putting out a campaign line written for him by Downing Street, which was a pretty shameful thing to do. The fact that this government has had a bit of a wobble this week is hardly Donald Trump's fault. We're not in an election period, and he has spoken about American foreign policy, about how America will do trade deals.
He's come here to trample all over our rather delicate politics at the moment.
Well, he's not trampling all over it. He's asked, will America do a trade deal if the UK is stuck with the European Union's rule book, to which the answer is probably not. That's just a straight answer to a straight question about American interest. That's not interfering in British politics, and the recent instability in British politics can hardly fairly be blamed on Donald Trump. He may be responsible for many things, but not the resignation of Boris Johnson and David Davis. That was because of this awful white paper.
Are you more loyal to Donald Trump than you are to Britain?
Sorry?
Are you more loyal to Donald Trump than you are to Britain?
Oh, don't be silly. No, of course my loyalty is to the Queen and to the country. May she reign over us for many years to come. It's the first time anyone's probably said God save the Queen on Channel 4 News. Thank you.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much indeed. Now, back to those protesters. Thousands of protesters have also gathered in the centre of Glasgow. Donald Trump is due to fly into the city's Prestwick airport shortly, what's billed as a private weekend visit. He and Melania are expected to stay at their luxury golf resort nearby to play golf. Our Scotland correspondent Kieran Jenkins is in Glasgow. Kieran, what's it like out there?
Well, President Trump expected to land in Scotland very shortly. Over the course of the evening, we've had a few thousand people come out here to give him the welcome they think he deserves. Yesterday, President Trump said he had great friendships in Scotland. Not too many of those in evidence here tonight or anywhere in the country where there have been protests, not just in London, in Sheffield, in Belfast, in Manchester. Many thousands have turned out to have their voices heard. But of course, a theme of this presidential visit is just how far away from the people he has been, in royal castles, in country estates, and now to golf courses. He's landing in Prestwick Airport, about an hour away from here, behind a deep police cordon, and that's where the official part of this visit ends. It becomes a private visit then, and he's going to his own golf resort, Turnberry in South Ayrshire, where he will meet his son Eric, who reportedly flew in yesterday accompanied by 40 or so American businessmen, no doubt keen to bend the president's ear on the golf course. Now, the security bill for that private Trump gathering at Turnberry will be met by the British taxpayer. It'll be running to a few £1 million, and there have been questions raised about that. But Donald Trump this afternoon was talking about his last visit to Turnberry in 2016, which he said was before the Brexit referendum. He predicted the Brexit result. Only one problem: he actually arrived the day after the Brexit referendum, when the result was already known. Untruths, of course, are factors swirling around his presidency. Protests too, and there will be more of these tomorrow in Edinburgh and Turnberry and across the country.
Kieran Jenkins in Glasgow, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Matt. Well, I'm joined now by two of today's protesters, Dr. Sholomos Shogbamimo, co-organiser of the Bring the Noise Women's March, and Majid Majid, former Somali refugee and now Lord Mayor of Sheffield, who used his post there to ban Donald Trump from visiting his city. Now, Mr. Mayor, wouldn't you rather have had a conversation? Shouldn't you have invited him and confronted him rather than banned him?
Well, John, what I'm trying to do is really highlight not only how dangerous Donald Trump's policies is, but basically just to say, as a country and the people of Sheffield that stand for equality, stand up for people's rights, that he's not actually welcome in Sheffield, because Sheffield was the first city of sanctuary. So everything that Donald Trump represents is not what we stand for. But actually allowing him and inviting him to the UK, what we do is legitimise everything that he stands for.
But it would surely be much easier to just try and have a conversation with him rather than just not have him at all.
Well, this is what it is. The people of America, they're our friends. And of course, friends are honest with each other, John. When your friend is stepping out of line, you need to be honest and straightforward with them and say, no, you're not welcome here.
All right, well now, what about the Women's March? I mean, is it in part because you are worried about his misogyny, which of course is notorious, or are you worried about race?
This is so much more than that, because what is happening and what we are doing transcends the very boundaries of all the things that we represent. The reason why Bring the Noise was put together today was for the people to stand together in solidarity against the inhumane, divisive, misogynistic and discriminatory policies from the Trump
solidarity
administration.
Mean men and women?
There were men there and drag queens.
It was the Women's March.
Led by women, because you know, when women get together, we're too hard to ignore. Yeah. So as you can see from today, there were over 70,000 people on the Women's March alone. What we stand for is to dismantle the political rhetoric of hate, phobia, fear that's coming out of the Trump-Pence administration.
As a woman, do you feel sympathy with Mrs. May?
No, not at all. Mrs. May. Theresa May has a job to do. The bottom line is, as a people, we are the government. And we're saying to Theresa May, you must represent us. In the last 24 hours, Donald Trump has shown again what kind of ally he is, which he is not. So it's important that we, the people, we've shown today that we are radical without losing focus, and we are bold without restraint.
What about what Mr. Trump said about Europe and immigrants? He says Europe is losing its identity. That's a funny thing to hear on the heels of the World Cup.
Yeah. And you know, just on the touch of the World Cup, if you look at what the England team have done, is what a lot of our politicians have failed to do. They've actually united the country, regardless of what your race, background, religion, everything is. They've actually united it. And just look at people here today. You've literally got everyone from different backgrounds just to send that message, whether you're gay, black, women, we're going to stand shoulder to shoulder with you and actually fight this misogyny.
So you would argue that this is Europe?
I would argue that Europe reflects what the unity of all of us are. But more importantly,
don't encourage them, Mr. Mayor. Do not encourage them.
But more importantly, are the British values that we hold. What we did today, all of these people that are standing here, has shown how our diversity transcends the boundaries of ethnicity, gender, race, anyone's choice of sex. So nobody on God's given earth, being Donald Trump, can stand against us. And
you can't hear her, Mr. Mayor, but do you agree with her?
110%.
That's right.
110%.
Seriously, Sheffield is a very multicultural city.
Yeah. It really is.
Can it be undone?
No, do you know what it is? People are always going to have their opinions, but I think by us coming together and saying, do you know what? This person stands for everything. As a city, like, we are living in a politics which is fueled with hate and division. And the last thing we need is somebody like Donald Trump that literally, not just legitimizes it, but also makes it human. It's like we need to do everything to stop that being normalized.
I can't let you go without saying I think a lot of people looking in will be staggered that a Somali refugee became mayor of Sheffield.
Well, do you know what? It's amazing. I think that's a testament to the people of Sheffield to say, do you know what, we're very proud of doing things differently. And it's great.
But you see, like you, Donald Trump was democratically elected.
Yeah, well,
you have to pay your money and take your choice.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that we have to agree with him or welcome or roll the red carpet out for him. So it really isn't like that.
I think it's clear that we and the American people, the British people and American people, will always have a special relationship. And we respect the office of the White House. We respect the democratic elections and their decisions. But we will not accept what is unacceptable. So if they put someone like Trump and Pence in charge, we have to rise up and stand up and say, these are our values. So when Theresa May and the cabinet sit with him, they have to take note of what we want, because if they don't represent us, we will vote them out.
Well, I want to thank you both very warmly for being here. Tonight's main news, Donald Trump is on his way to Scotland tonight after lavishing warm praise on Theresa May at their joint press conference in Chequers, claiming US-UK relations are at the highest level of special. This in rather stark contrast to his interview in the Sun newspaper this morning, when he savaged Mrs May and her Brexit strategy. At the same time, here in central London, hundreds of thousands of people have turned out to protest against Mr Trump's visit. Organisers are calling a carnival of resistance.
What a difference a few hours makes when it comes to President Trump. After attacking the Prime Minister's Brexit plans yesterday, today he seemed to make up for any offence, heaping personal praise on her and describing the UK-US relationship as the highest level of special. From their summit at Chequers, it was onwards and upwards to Windsor, and what must be the highlight of the visit for Mr Trump, tea with the Queen. What he didn't see for himself were the demonstrations around the country protesting against his visit here and his policies at home.
The world's most powerful leader with the UK's Prime Minister, hand-holding in an unpredictable and challenging world. Now, she'd feared a slip in this important first meeting on British soil, because overnight he'd warned that her proposed Brexit deal would make it impossible for Britain to negotiate her cherished trade deal with him. So would it?
We agreed today that as the UK leaves the European Union, we will pursue an ambitious US-UK free trade agreement.
The President agreed, although he didn't seem completely confident that Brexit would actually happen.
Once the Brexit process is concluded and perhaps the UK has left the EU, I don't know what they're going to do, but whatever you do is okay with me. That's your decision. Whatever you're going to do is okay with us. Just make sure we can trade together. That's all that matters. The United States looks forward to finalizing a great bilateral trade agreement with the United Kingdom.
On Brexit, though, she stood up for herself.
I heard the turn of phrase that the President used earlier, but let me be very clear about this. We will be leaving the European Union.
Prime Minister, the President said yesterday that he gave you advice about how to negotiate Brexit, that you didn't take that advice. I wondered what that advice was and whether you have any regrets about not taking it.
Well, Robert, lots of people give me advice about how to negotiate with the European Union. My job is actually getting out there and doing it.
I did give her a suggestion. I wouldn't say advice. And I think she found it maybe too brutal. And that's okay, because I could see that. And maybe someday she'll do that. If they don't make the right deal, she might very well do what I suggested that she might want to do. But it is not an easy thing.
And what about reports that the President backed Boris Johnson, who quit a few days ago as Foreign Secretary, to succeed May?
They asked about Boris Johnson. I said, yeah, how would he be as a Prime Minister? I said, he'll be a great Prime Minister. He's been very nice to me. He's been saying very good things about me as President. I think he thinks I'm doing a great job. I am doing a great job, that I can tell you. I also said that this incredible woman right here is doing a fantastic job, a great job. And I mean that. She's a very smart, very tough, very capable person. And I would much rather have her as my friend than my enemy. That I can tell you.
The President was also asked to explain controversial remarks he made that immigration is damaging the fabric of Europe.
I know it's politically not necessarily correct to say that, but I'll say it, and I'll say it loud. And I think they better watch themselves, because you are changing culture, you are changing a lot of things, you're changing security.
On this, the Prime Minister begged to differ.
The UK has a proud history of welcoming people who are fleeing persecution to our country. We have a proud history of welcoming people who want to come to our country to contribute to our economy and contribute to our society. And over the years, overall immigration has been good for the UK.
Mr. President, how would you characterise your relationship with the United Kingdom? More special than with other countries?
I would say I give our relationship, in terms of grade, the highest level of special. So we start off with special. I would give our relationship with the UK, and now, especially after this 2 days, with your Prime Minister, I would say the highest level of special. Now, am I allowed to go higher than that? I'm not sure.
As you can hear, the President is about to fly off, and after that press conference, all I can say is wow. In all my time covering politics, I've never witnessed anything quite like that. Up and away, and goodness only knows what lies over the horizon for the relationship between Britain and America.
Yeah, wow, goodness, what a day, what a week. What do you make of it all, and where does it leave the Prime Minister tonight?
Well, she avoided catastrophe today, and that by no means looks certain overnight when The Sun reported President Trump saying that he wasn't going to give her a trade deal because he didn't like her plans for taking us out of the European Union. He didn't think they were consistent with a trade deal. So today, she did persuade him to say those words, that he's still looking for some kind of free trade arrangement with the UK, but it wasn't all plain sailing by any means. I mean, you know, he sort of hinted that he thought the terms of trade between us and the UK, us and the US weren't brilliant, and therefore any actually trade deal might not be as marvellous as many Brexiters would like. He kept saying he thought that Boris Johnson, who only resigned a few days ago in protest at her Brexit plans, he kept saying he would make a brilliant Prime Minister. Now, surely he knows that there are plenty of people in the UK who are plotting with Boris to unseat her. So that was pretty destabilising. So, you know, I'd say it was a sort of mixed day, but it could have been a lot worse. Problem for her is things are still ahead of her that could do terrible damage. So just as I was leaving, there was a handful of Brexit rebellious MPs waiting to go in and see her, to be persuaded by her not to vote against her Brexit plans next week. I mean, you know, there's still quite a lot of rumblings that there could even be a leadership test, a vote of confidence about whether she should continue at the helm, you know, before the summer. I mean, you know, it is an astonishing, I keep saying this whenever we talk, you know, it's an astonishingly unstable period in British politics, and I don't see any sign of stability anytime soon. And so it goes on. Robert Peston, thank you very much. Thank you. So to the tens of thousands of people who took to the streets today, brandishing placards and chanting slogans in protest against the visit. Away from the ceremonials and the formalities, this was a very different kind of reception for President Trump. The mood of angry ridicule was summed up by the Trump baby balloon seen among the crowded streets and squares of the capital.
This was the alternative welcome, loud and proud from the thousands who don't want Donald Trump here. And this was their alternative president, a mocked and disrespected blimp. If Donald Trump had ventured onto the streets of London today, he would have found no friends here. The Sheridan family had travelled to the capital together to deliver their message of opposition in person.
I don't agree with anything that Trump stands for, none of us do, and we're angry that Theresa May has invited him here.
I think the children in cages was just the last straw, so we're proud to be here as a family.
I've got my prehistoric CND badge.
Others, like 83-year-old Carol Murphy, were stirred by anger to take to the streets again.
He's so ludicrously, impossibly awful that it leaves you speechless, doesn't it?
And marching too were some Americans, including one who lives here.
I feel that Donald Trump is leading America in the wrong way, and by coming here, he's starting to capture the same unthinking populism that he started in America here, pushing Boris Johnson, pushing Brexit. It's awful.
But there was also a new generation of protesters. The young and women dominated this crowd. Some had been on many demonstrations, some belonged to unions or organised groups. And some, like Nadia Aziz, a teaching assistant, had just come on their own.
What's your primary cause? Because there's so many causes.
There's so many. I think for me, we're feminists, so we believe that women should not be spoken to about all that in the way that he has.
This is a very mixed group. Donald Trump has acted like a lightning rod, bringing out protesters who want to make a stand about everything that he represents, and they feel this trip endorses. But as the tens of thousands brought central London to a standstill, there were also those who felt this protest was a waste of time.
We're paying for all this. It's where my tax is going. It's got 5–10 million in policing. It's ridiculous. There's nothing we can do about it. The guy's in power. That's what his country voted for.
In this country, there were protests in other major cities too. Outside Sheffield City Hall, in Manchester's Albert Square, and in Belfast city centre. This trip and this president have so far been without precedent. No other American leader has ever brought people out onto the streets in such numbers and in such opposition. There was more than one welcoming committee for President Trump, and the unofficial one simply didn't want him here. Penny Marshall, News at 10, Trafalgar Square.
It might not have been a full state visit, but there was no doubt which part of today President Trump enjoyed the most. The one official picture released of Donald Trump with the Queen inside Windsor Castle shows him grinning from ear to ear. The Queen's expression is a little more inscrutable.
She was on schedule, as she always is, but even the Queen's staff were checking their watches to make sure this American president, the 12th one she has met, was on time for tea. And through the George IV gates at 5 o'clock came the convoy for the part of his visit here that Donald Trump was most looking forward to. The Queen watched him carefully. She, of course, has done this many times before. Mr. Trump is an unconventional president for sure, but he must have read the memo about not taking the Queen's hand at the steps in the way in which he has so many times taken Theresa May's. He didn't, however, pay attention to the briefing about the Guard of Honour. The Queen beckoned him towards her troops, but her guest didn't shift over. If she hoped Mr. Trump would follow her lead, it didn't work, and she ended up stuck behind him. And they inspected the household cavalry in silence, perhaps just as well, because units of the Coldstream Guards once fought against Americans battling for independence from Britain. Some things are best left unsaid. Once inside, just one image was allowed of the Queen, the President and the First Lady, and this was it. He was grinning from ear to ear. The picture of taking tea with the Queen at Windsor Castle was in the bag. Donald Trump would have had less to smile about, however, had he looked outside.
The last time the streets of Windsor had this many people on them, it was for the marriage of Prince Harry and Meghan in May. Today, however, the majority of people are here for an entirely different reason. The placards were royal themed and mostly polite, but the protesters saw precisely nothing. The Trumps came and left by helicopter, and you had to search very hard to find those who came today to support the president.
I have seen people here, they're coming from Saudi Arabia where they are beheading people, all the time, and they have done a good welcome. Somebody's coming from some other countries,
So you think the protests were over the top?
Oh, definitely, it was too much,
It took less than an hour, but tea drunk, guards inspected, photos taken, and Donald Trump was on his way. Chris Ship, News at 10, Windsor.
Well, tonight, after today's dizzying diplomacy shuttle, President Trump is at his luxury golf resort in Scotland. The demonstrations against him are continuing, though, with more planned for the weekend.
Donald Trump arrived in Scotland tonight, and there was a not-so-welcome party for him in Glasgow.
Musicians against Trump.
A crowd of 2,000 were in George Square in a protest with a distinctly Scottish flavour. Inspired by the president, protesters built a wall. They say they want to make Trump pay.
As you can see, the range of sort of things that have been written on the wall and sort of reflect.
No one is illegal, we all come from somewhere.
Exactly.
There's an immigration message here.
Partly because that's what he's going hard on.
A tiny handful of Trump supporters did try to gate crash, but they were outnumbered and shouted down. Author and rapper Darren McGarvey says this is a time for Scots to speak out.
Find yourself kind of quietly pining for the nostalgia of somebody like George W. Bush. I mean, that's the situation that we're in. You're thinking, you know what, actually, Dick Cheney wasn't really that bad. I think it's good to see disparate groups setting their differences aside in order to send a very clear message from Scotland that a guy like this can't be tolerated.
Donald Trump speaks proudly of his own special relationship with Scotland, the land where his mother was born. But not everyone here shares the sentiment.
I think Donald Trump probably pays quite a lot of attention to social media. We know he uses Twitter, and social media right now is viral with anti-Trump protests. So I think it'll have an impact.
President Trump has now retreated to the quiet confines of Turnberry, but those protesting want to ensure the Scottish leg of his visit is more than just an expensive golf trip. Peter Smith, News at 10, Glasgow.
Martin Geisler is at Turnberry in Scotland. A bit of excitement there tonight, Martin. Perhaps some nervousness from the police this evening.
Yeah, absolutely, Nina. President Trump arrived here maybe an hour ago. He went in through a service entrance with his convoy. He was swept in through there, but appeared on the front steps of the hotel shortly after with an entourage, watching a fairly majestic sunset, I have to say, over the Isle of Arran on the horizon just across to my right. But the tranquility was shattered very suddenly by a paraglider who came into view powered by a fan and carrying a large flag. He swept round in front of the hotel. The canopy had a Greenpeace logo on it. The flag had the slogan, "Trump well below par, resist." He swept round right in front of the hotel, got to maybe 50, 100 yards from President Trump, who was escorted very quickly, unsurprisingly, back into the building by a security detail. The protester circled a couple more times, then flew off, pursued, as you'd imagine, by a large number of police officers. Mr. Trump's been back out since, listening to a piper on the steps of the hotel again. We understand that tomorrow he is likely to play golf. He does like to swing a club, and he owns the course. There was a rumour that he was trying to line up a high-profile opponent. We don't know who. You might remember Rory McIlroy provided that service once, not so long ago. It didn't end very well for him. There was a fairly substantial public backlash after that, but I'm sure we'll find out if he has got an opponent tomorrow. He leaves here, we understand, on Sunday for Finland, where he has that meeting with Vladimir Putin.
Martin Geisler, thank you. Our Washington correspondent Robert Moore has been following President Trump's visit, and he joins me now. Look, you're very familiar with the way this president works. To what extent the diplomatic chaos he has caused in the last 2 days, is that a deliberate tactic on his part?
Well, he is a disruptor in chief. You know, it's the way he conducts foreign policy. The only surprise to me, perhaps, is that Downing Street was so surprised by how he did conduct himself. Very often before a visit, he makes these kind of incendiary comments. He sucks the oxygen out of the room. He shocks his hosts, but then rows back and makes more conciliatory comments. So that was the playbook at the G7 summit in Quebec. It was the playbook earlier this week in Brussels at the NATO summit, and so it proved to be here. I think the big question tonight is which was the authentic Trump? Was it the provocateur who gave that interview to the Sun and who was prepared to humiliate Theresa May, or was it the more conciliatory figure that we saw in the gardens of Chequers today?
And once the dust settles, this long talked about visit, how will it be viewed?
Well, one former very senior American diplomat said tonight that this is the single most chaotic and disruptive and destructive visit ever made to Europe by an American president. Certainly the NATO part of the trip, I think, deeply alarmed, even shocked European leaders. This is obviously the last 24 hours have obviously been deeply polarizing. And remember, the most consequential part of the tour by far still lies ahead, this Helsinki summit meeting with President Putin. So the final chapter of these extraordinary few days still has to be written.
Robert Moore, thank you very much. Thank you.
Not so much a press conference as an anxiety dream played out in real time. In bright sunshine and the picture-perfect setting of an English country garden, Prime Minister May stood graciously beside the President, who'd just rubbished her whole plan for Brexit hours earlier. This time, he was eager to lavish praise on the PM, telling the media their relationship was the highest level of special. Moments later, like the world's worst boyfriend in front of a vulnerable beloved, he reiterated his belief that her nemesis, the recently departed Boris Johnson, would make a great Prime Minister. It was excruciating, it was vulgar, it was exaggerated, ultimately perhaps deeply predictable. It was everything we've come to expect from America's 45th president, but tonight he is gone and she'll be left with the headache. Does anything he said alter what she does next? Nick Watt reports.
With your smile so...
As with all special relationships, this couple have been through a rocky patch. But Theresa May and Donald Trump are back together after a note of contrition from the errant partner.
When I saw her this morning, I said, I want to apologize because I said such good things about you. She said, don't worry, it's only the press.
The disruptor-in-chief showered the Prime Minister with praise after ripping into her Brexit strategy. But some of the fundamentals remain unchanged.
I think she's a terrific woman. I think she's doing a terrific job. And that Brexit is a very tough situation. That's a tough deal between the borders and the entries into the countries and all of the things. So she's going to do the best. The only thing I ask is that she work it out so that we can have very even trade.
There will be no limit to the possibility of us doing trade deals around the rest of the world once we leave the European Union on the basis of the agreement that was made here at Chequers and that I've put forward to the European Union. And just to be clear, that is an agreement that delivers on the Brexit vote that we had in 2016 here in the UK, that delivers what I believe is at the forefront of people's minds when they were voting to leave the European Union.
Someday. Sweetness and light in the Chequers sunshine. But there will always be more than two people in this relationship.
Boris Johnson, I think, would be a great Prime Minister.
And in every relationship, it is complicated.
Anger in the summer air, though friends of Theresa May say she's entitled to a moment of relaxation after a potentially disastrous visit was rescued at the 11th hour. But the President's challenge to the Prime Minister on Brexit shone a light on the defining issue of her premiership and provided fodder for both sides.
If the visit wasn't punishment enough, the Prime Minister invited Brexiteer Tories to air their concerns over tea shortly after the President had left. This group are seizing on his Brexit intervention.
Obviously, as a Brexiteer, I'm very pleased that the President of a great country like the US is on the side of us Brexiteers, and that he can see, you know, the dangers and the consequences that us Brexiteers can see for our country.
But a pro-European Tory who recently resigned from the government over Brexit believes the President's intervention highlights the concerns of his side.
The plan agreed at Chequers last week is, you know, coming into contact with geopolitical reality. This is not a done deal. We've got to go to Europe and cut this deal. And I think President Trump's intervention is, look, if you want to have a deal with us, this is how it's going to be. And I'm guessing the European Union will say, and this is how it's going to be. And I don't quite see how we do both.
One Tory grandee believes the episode has strengthened the Prime Minister, who will be able to negotiate a strong transatlantic trade deal without jeopardising EU links.
My view is, and always has been, that it should be, we should ride all the horses. This country has survived and prospered in the world by being clever and nimble. And we are now leaving the European Union, to my regret, but we are leaving the European Union. We're going to have as close a relationship as we possibly can with the European Union, of course a whole wide range of issues, including especially trade and security and all the rest of it. And we're going to have a big trade arrangement with the United States of America, I very much hope. It's in the interests of all sides, America, Europe, Britain. It's in everyone's interest that this works.
Never change. It was a proud day for this most royalist of US presidents, though his protocol may need a little work. Faltering relationships do have their awkward moments. For now, this one is back on track, though the choices flowing from Brexit guarantee future challenges.
Just the way you look tonight.
Well, that was Nick Watt. Nick's here now. Nick, we heard Donald Trump praising Johnson in your piece there. What news of the former Foreign Secretary now? What's he up to next week?
Well, Boris Johnson is back. The Daily Telegraph tomorrow announcing that he's signed his column again. That will be back on Monday. And as I understand it, he's planning to make a speech in Parliament on Wednesday explaining why he resigned as Foreign Secretary. Now, it's interesting Wednesday. He is therefore doing it after 2 days of Brexit legislations and votes on Monday and Tuesday. And the reason for the delay is that he wants to sort of express his very, very deep concern at the way that Brexit is going, but he doesn't want to be a sort of a rallying point for Conservative Brexiteers who are thinking of defeating the government. And the danger for the government is that on 2 days running, there are going to be 2 yes and no votes on these 2 bills. And there is a theoretical possibility that the Labour Party, which is guaranteed to vote against these bills, that they could be joined with quite a large number of Brexiteer Tories. Interesting, though, I spoke to one of those senior Brexiteer Tories. This person said to me that to vote with Labour would be an act of war against Theresa May, and they're thinking very, very carefully. Maybe now is not quite the time to do that.
Fascinating, Nick. What does Labour think of that as an idea? Ed Miliband was on the protest march earlier today, and this evening I spoke to the former Labour leader from his Doncaster constituency. Started by talking to him about what about Donald Trump he was protesting against.
Well, most importantly, his values, his racism, his misogyny, his respect for authoritarian regimes and his apparent contempt for democratic regimes. And I think it is important to take a stand on this, because I do think that his values and where he stands are on the side of, they seem to be on the side of authoritarianism and not on the side of the democratic values that I think are shared across political parties in the UK. I thought it was an extraordinary number of people that came out. I think they spoke for lots of people in Britain. The thousands spoke for the millions of people in Britain who feel this way. So I think it was right to take a stand.
Was it right that he was here?
Well, I personally, if I'd been in Theresa May's shoes, would not have done it this way. I wouldn't have rushed to the White House at the first opportunity. I'm afraid it hasn't really got her anything. I almost felt sorry for her in that press conference, but it was classic Trump. He lied by claiming that him criticising her was fake news. That was a lie. He attacked the press, and he made appalling remarks about immigration and its effect on Europe. Now, to be fair, she did disagree with that, but for my liking, she was too passive. She's been too passive. And if you like, this is the moment when you're either siding with a guy who respects authoritarians, likes dictators, and comes along and tries to upend democratic countries. He did it with Merkel at the NATO summit. He did it with May here with his Sun interview. So you're either on that side or his side. I'm afraid we've looked too much on his side, really.
Where do you think the Trump visit has now left that Brexit deal? Is he right about the Chequers deal she's concocted?
Well, in relation to the Chequers deal, I have a different perspective on it. Look, I actually think it's a sort of modest step forward from the previous position, but I still have real worries about what it means for services, 80% of the economy excluded. I have real worries about whether the customs partnership proposal, whatever it's now called, can actually really work. And it's not really a deal because it's actually got to now be negotiated with the European Union. So I don't, if he's in a sort of hard Brexit, Farage, Johnson position, I obviously don't share his perspective on that. On the wider US front, I think this US trade deal is a mirage. I don't think it's going to happen. I think if it did happen, the impact would be marginal. And actually, you know, I don't think we want to buy the American chlorinated chicken or beef hormone-related beef and all of that.
The only thing that unites all of you who say it's not a good deal is how differently you feel about what the outcome should be. Isn't the truth that the gamble is now between no deal and no Brexit, and half are pushing for a hard no deal and half are pushing for, you know, a very soft, almost nothing Brexit?
I don't see it that way. Look, I think in the end, Parliament has got to be sovereign in relation to this. And it's got to be a deal that can command a majority across Parliament. And we cannot make economically disastrous decisions for our country, and certainly it could be in relation to services, and it could be in relation to the customs union, not just economically, in relation to Northern Ireland. We can't be forced into terrible decisions because of some threat which I don't believe.
What about if the EU were to accept this? Would you still reject it, or would you say, come on, we've got 6 months, we're halfway there, we can iron out the rest as we go?
I don't think ironing out the rest as we go is a great way forward. I think we've got to look at the deal that comes back, and we've got to take a decision on its merits. But if you're asking me, am I worried about the impact on services? Am I worried about the impact on Northern Ireland of what's been sketched out in Chequers, albeit that it's better than what seemed to be on offer before? Yes, I am worried about it.
But does worried mean that
the notion, as I say, that we should be...
Sorry, does worried mean that you could imagine accepting it still? No.
Well, I'm saying no, I don't like this deal, no. I don't like this deal. I don't decide Labour's position. I'm going to be guided by Labour's position on this. But if you're asking me what do I think of the deal that it's not a deal, the Chequers position that she has outlined, I have deep worries about what it means for our country going forward.
Let me finish by saying you are in Doncaster now, your own constituency, heavily Leave vote there. Do you feel, when you are constantly arguing against the wishes of many of the people around you that voted for you, that you are encouraging essentially a democratic deficit?
Well, I'm not arguing against their position. I mean, look, what I've been saying to you in this interview is, I accept the result of the referendum.
Union.
As you say, my constituent... Well, to be fair, Emily, the customs union and the single market were not a question on the ballot paper. You know, what was on the ballot paper is, are we leaving or remaining in the European Union? And people voted to leave, you know, as you say, heavily in my constituency. And, you know, I do make this point, which is, I think this is about the unity of the country in the end, and how you can move past this. And that's why I say, you know, respect the result, and that's really difficult for lots of people I know who supported Remain, and I understand why that's difficult. But at the same time, stay close to the European Union. And, you know, in a way, if one thing, to unite the two bits of our conversation, if one thing is proved by today, if anything is proved, it's Donald Trump is an unreliable ally. If we care about the institutions of the UN, the European Union, NATO, you know, we can't just cut ourselves off. We've got to remain closely aligned with the European Union.
Ed Miliband, thank you very much.
Thank you.